Hello, podcast listeners. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to another episode of my show. You're listening and you're thinking, this sounds a little bit different from before. It's true. One of the things I love about when I started a podcast is that I didn't want to select a name or put myself in a specific kind of, format or genre, other than just to put my name in the podcast and feel the freedom to change things up anytime I needed to. And you have heard this if you're an avid listener or someone who's been following my show for a while. Since I started this thing I think it was Christmas time as when I started this podcast. But some of you have walked with me through a lot of the format changes and different things. And that to me was a feature of this podcast. I went with a rigid, 1 hour format or a rigid half hour format to feel a little more like radio. And honestly, right now, I'm feeling a shift in myself, and here's why. Here's why there are shifts going on in me. If you are someone who just is joining this podcast, or you're just getting to know me, I am in seminary. I went back to school to get my master's, and I'm working towards a doctorate right now. But one thing that happens in the fall and anytime classes begin is my life just gets absolutely chaotic. And right now, my life is totally and absolutely, utterly chaotic. I've got this podcast. I have a full load. I have 7 classes to finish up my master's before my doctorate work begins. I also started a residency for chaplaincy in a hospital, and I'm a parent, among other things. And I'm also started doing a lot of work in my church again. My life and my schedule is chaotic. And when I'm recording this podcast today, and you'll see why, I'm not doing a live this week and maybe for a few weeks because my life is nuts. And what I need is to kind of take a break from the preparation, but I want to continue to give you, my listeners, really great content. And today, I'm actually excited about what I'm going to do with the show today. This last summer, during Pride Month, I went on a podcast with a friend of mine. His name's Kevin Wilson. And he hosts a podcast called Thinking Out Loud. It's about navigating culture from a biblical perspective. Now, Kevin Wilson is an evangelical pastor. Comes from very conservative pastoral theology. He pastored in a conservative church, and has this podcast about his take on the Bible and the world today. Well, he interviewed me and invited me onto his show in the middle of Pride Month. And the episode, if you go look up his podcast called Thinking Out Loud, it's episode 129. It's called Breaking Barriers, a Christian conservative pastor and a transgender pastor. And today we're going to be listening to part 1 of that series. And what kind of motivated me as I was walking out of church, and the drummer in our worship team and his wife started talking to me and saying that they listened to this podcast on a road trip. And they said it was so encouraging to their faith as progressive Christians. And this, as you'll hear Kevin say in the very beginning of our time in his interview with me, this really is an important conversation because you're getting to hear a conservative pastor and a transgender pastor, me, have a loving, respectful, kind, yet challenging conversation about our views on theology and the Bible. And so I'm excited for you to hear this this podcast that I was a part of. I'm going to play part 1 this week, and next week I'll play part 2. You can see what I'm doing. I'm going to be sharing with you over the next, little while here, just some podcasts that I've been a part of throughout the last year and interviews that I've done to also kind of give me some room right now in my studies, but to continue offering you, my listeners, a great weekly podcast. Thank you for journeying with me always through the twists and turns of my life and my career and this show. And I'm excited for you to hear this conversation with my friend, Kevin Wilson, in the Thinking Out Loud podcast. Enjoy this amazing conversation. Here we go.
Goal of this episode is to model what it looks like to have a respectful dialogue with two people who disagree on things that are really important to them. Okay. And I would say as Christians, I think this is where we have erred in the past. We a lot of times lob rocks over the wall and we can't even see the person that's on the other side of the wall because of our own thoughts and what we feel and what we think and all the things, right? And we talk a lot about community at church and we talk about getting together and understanding people and all of those things. And I think we do it when we agree with a person, but when we don't agree, we struggle to collaborate. And so my desire here is for us to model this for all of you that are listening or watching this. And as you know, I am a straight heterosexual man, evangelical Christian man. And our guest today identifies as a Christian transgender woman. And her name is Joanna Whaley. Is it Wally or Whaley?
Whaley.
All right.
Yep,
I just want to make sure. It's Joanna Whaley. She is a transgender woman who was an evangelical pastor. She's been in ministry for 20 some years. And most of her career was a pastor at a megachurch. When Joanna was outed by her church and fired for being LGBTQ, she began to advocate for the rights of all people to have access to faith. She hosts a podcast called the Joanna Whaley Podcast. You can find it anywhere that you stream podcasts. And Joanna joins me now. Joanna, welcome to the Thinking Out Loud podcast.
Well, Kevin, thank you.
Yeah.
What a perfect setup and exactly what I advocate in all of my work.
Yeah.
Having these conversations in a loving, respectful way and walking away friends at the end of it. Well, maybe not even friends, but at least with respect for one another in the conversation. Yes. So I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. And so I'm going to jump right into some questions because I know, what I'd like to do is for people to know Joanna, the human. Right? Who are you? Your life, all of that. Because I know a lot of people are going to have questions about a lot of different things. And I just want to start off with understanding, your childhood. Did you grow up in church? What did that look like?
Yeah, I had a great childhood. And I grew up with a single mom. Okay. Mom, and for some reasons we'll get into later, as to why some of my childhood was brought up in some of my faith, conversations around my gender. But I grew up with a single mom, lived with my grandparents most of my life. And, but we were very Catholic, a very Catholic family, like through and through. Like my grandmother was probably the more Catholic than the Pope, I feel like at times. She was going to church. She was in mass. I felt like 7 times a day. This woman was very devout to her faith and really instilled faith in me, as well as with my grandparents, or with my grandpa. Like he was also a choir director in our Catholic parish. And, our whole family, everyone in our entire family was Catholic. And, and I honestly grew up in a very loving home. My mother was a single mom and did the very best she could. And I look back on that very fondly. So I met my dad when I was going into the 5th grade. It was actually the first time I ever met my dad. And that, as we'll get into a little bit, if you want to get in, we'll probably get into some of the ideas of gender and inversion theory, ideas and all that later on. But that, and now I have a great relationship with my dad. And so it started late in life with me and him. And that's when so that's been a little bit of like my childhood. Played all the sports, did all the things that you were supposed to as at the time, a little boy growing up in suburban Detroit. But church was a huge staple of our life and our family.
When did you become a Christian? So, obviously growing up and we all like go to church, especially if our parents are going to church, we have that drug problem. We get drugged to church. But when did you, kind of step out of, hey, this is my parents' faith and make it your own?
Yeah, I have. It's funny. I have 2 kind of distinct moments. One of them was in my earlier childhood when I started to understand I'm interested in Jesus. I'm interested in the church. I was more interested in sort of the traditional part of what our family's tradition. And really it was my grandfather's funeral was a huge moment in my faith formation. To see the impact of his life through Jesus on thousands of people. I mean, there wasn't an empty seat. I mean, they were packing into the streets. I couldn't even fit everybody. That was a huge moment. Wow. But I would say the moment when I made like a conscious decision to say, I am giving my life to Jesus. Like the raise the hands, altar call moment was in 2003. I went to Spring Hill Camp in northern Michigan, middle of the winter, freezing cold. And this preacher named David Dean, he was a Christian comedian, preached a message for the first time in my life that I really understood the gospel in my own terms, in my own language as a teenager. And that was the moment this band called Fisher's Net was playing in the background behind the preacher. And that was the moment I raised my hand. I came up front and I said, this man, Jesus, is who I want to follow and serve for the rest of my life. And it was the winter of 2023 was like the biggest spiritual decision I ever made in my life. Up until some moments later in life for me.
Sure. So how did you get into, so obviously we're going to kind of speed up here to later in life. You, at some point you left the Catholic Church, became more of a Protestant, evangelical Christian. What was that like? What was the break there?
Yeah, the transition was interesting. So, I played baseball. We grew up in a very sports-centered family, and my mom was like a all-state softball player. So, like, baseball and softball ran in our family. Well, on my baseball team, this kid named Josh kept inviting me every single day to his cool youth group. He said, "You got to come check this thing out. Right. You have to come check it out. You have to come check it out." And eventually, I went, and there was this band with like drums and electric guitars and like kids enjoying being there, which was so foreign to me, because I came from like this Catholic youth group where kids were like forced to be there. So that began the transition. And then I became part of the youth ministry at this local church, big megachurch in the area. And the youth pastor invited me and this is when I kind of started feeling like, and my entrance out of Catholicism and into the evangelical space was really a call from Jesus into ministry. And in 2005, the youth pastor, he said, "Hey, we're going to go to a concert." He didn't even tell me who it was. He's just like, "We're going to go to a concert in Chicago." I'm like, "What?" So we're going to drive 3 hours. And he takes me to see this little band called Hillsong United at Willow Creek Church. And that was just the moment when I was like, I have to like leave this more like, I have to leave my Catholic roots behind and follow where I believe the Holy Spirit's taking me. And so that was the moment of shift for me. And it pushed me into ministry, and it pushed me into the evangelical space. And that was a life-changing time. Best concert I've ever been to, by the way.
Wow. Yeah. So you had this kind of this moment, you went to this concert. So when did you start feeling a call to the ministry specifically? Yeah.
So it was actually that night at Hillsong.
Okay.
I had been interested in joining the worship team when I first started going to the youth group, but I was kind of like on the fence about everything. But I remember specifically that evening being in this huge church. I mean, thousands of people worshiping. And I just remembered in that moment, everyone in one faith and proclaiming this one truth and love for Jesus in this moment. It captivated my heart. And I remember specifically God saying and speaking to my heart that night saying, "This is what I'm calling you into." And that pushed me into it. And so I got into ministry through music. And that really pushed me through for the next, 15 to 20 years of my life. I had songs on the radio and wrote worship songs. And it was that moment that really pushed me into it. And it was just a life-changing moment. And, when you have an experience with the Holy Spirit, it just changes everything.
Oh, yeah.
And you can't really put words to it.
That's true.
But everything changes.
Yes.
And so that was that moment for me. It was a beautiful and terrifying moment all at the same time.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, okay. And so you're now, as speaking at that time, you are now a worship leader. You are in ministry. You are identifying at that time as a man. What did that feel like? Because obviously there was at some point you were like, not feeling right here, right? Like,
just kidding.
Yeah. Right. Just kidding. There is some point where you're like, something's not right or something's going on. So tell me a little bit about that. Like, when did you start feeling something was off?
Absolutely. It's a great question. So I began to notice something was going on when I was around the age of 6, 7, or 8. In that range. I was young.
Okay.
I started to notice, but in that time, it was early 90s, early to mid 90s. We didn't have, there wasn't a lot of language in our little world about gender or being trans. And I remember these experiences I was having, and they were gender non-normative, if you will. So I was wrestling with some of these things, and my mom started to pick up on it when I was younger. And so our only language was, "Are you gay?" And at the time, I'm like, no, I don't think I'm gay. I just like your clothes, and I like girly things, and I like, I really am drawn to these things. And so that began that journey in me. But it really was in that time, the culture of like school and high school and middle school was very like, if you were queer, then your life was awful.
Yeah.
Like, kids did everything they could to make your life awful. And so I just didn't talk about it. I just pushed it down. And then, kind of fast forwarding, like being a pastor, being a minister, and presenting as and identifying publicly as a male, but on the inside, being female was a very weird feeling because I thought, and my assumption was because I walked into these churches that were, hey, we're so happy you're here. Come as you are. Mm-hmm. We love everyone. Be yourself. Be authentic. I thought that I was safe. And it began to build what turned out to be a very false sense of safety for me. And so at first I thought I was totally fine. I had no issues. I was like, yeah, I've always kind of wrestled with this thing, but I didn't really have language for it or anything like that. But then I started hearing things from the pulpit and started hearing things in the back halls about queer people, about gay people, about trans people. And I was like, oh, this is what I've wrestled with my whole life. You know, the things they're saying are exactly how I've always felt on the inside. And that's when, so my journey went from safety to, okay, now I feel really safe to tell my pastors because like they're saying they want us to be honest. They want us to have this open dialogue and this authenticity. So what I started perceiving as a conviction of the Holy Spirit that I needed to tell my pastors what was going on. I did. I told my pastors. And that began a 15-year journey of conversion therapy for me, where I was told, and mind you, I'm on staff at this church. I'm getting my paycheck, my whole network of friends, my whole family is attending this church. And so I'm told if I don't go to this counseling, I will be fired from my job and I'll lose everything. And so I did. So for about 15 years of my life, being a pastor, worshiping as a biological male, I was absolutely in the fight of my life, believing that I was fighting the sin of my entire lifespan. That I was fighting the demons within. That's what I believed. And I thought that I was pushing away my sinful nature. And all the while going through this conversion therapy that was trying to change me and trying to pray it all away. And it was the most difficult 15 years of my life. I had 5 great years, and then I had 15 years of absolute turmoil. But trying to put on my church smile on Sundays while dying on the inside.
Yeah. So for people that don't know what conversion therapy is, could you just in a nutshell talk about like what that is?
Yeah. Conversion therapy it has different names now. It unfortunately is still practiced within Christianity, within evangelical counseling centers. It's often called biblical counseling, or it's called reparative therapy. And what it is it is an attempt to change your gender identity or sexual orientation to a preferred heteronormative state, or what many in these counseling centers would say, God's original design for you. And so what it does is it uses methods that have been communicated by almost every single mental health board in the world, saying that it actually causes more trauma than anything, to try and change. And it's actually illegal in most states now in the United States. I know where I live, Michigan, just recently made it illegal. But it is very coercive therapy tactics to try and make you straight or make the appearance of being straight and cisgender. That's it in a nutshell.
And you were, and you know, during this time, so let me ask you this. When did you, so you got married, right? You got married to a woman. How did were you struggling at that time when you got married, or was that one of those things where it's like, well, I need to do the straight thing because this is the culture I'm in? Like,
yeah. So there was a few factors going on, and I'm usually I'm very guarded about. I'm definitely very careful when it comes to talking about my ex-wife because I want to make sure to honor her story and let her tell hers. But part of the conversion therapy, and even at the time, and I don't know if this is still a pervasive teaching within Christian churches, but there was this pervasive teaching going on that said, it was the verse where Paul says, if you can't control your lust, you need to get married, so that you don't burn with lust. Or exactly. And so there was this whole teaching going on of get married early, get married young, get married as fast as possible. And then there was also this other narrative where it's if you're going to be a pastor and you want to move up in the world, you need to have a wife and kids. But then if you add those two things going on in the background, in my conversion therapy, I was counseled to never give this words. Don't give this words anymore. Because if you give it words, you give it life. If you keep talking about this, you're going to give the enemy a foothold. And so you need to claim your victory. And so this, you don't struggle with this anymore. This doesn't exist. And I was actually counseled not to discuss this ever again, that this never happened anymore in my heart. And so another part of that teaching was they were you need to get married and you need to start having a heterosexual relationship and you need to get married quickly. And that was part of my counsel. And so I get married and I fall in love with a woman and it's going great, but all the while still going through this counsel and never talking about this. And that's where I try to be very fair to my ex is she got married not knowing this because I was in the middle of counsel and working through this idea I cannot ever talk about this again because I have victory over it. And so that was and you can see where that is a recipe for disaster. And that's where I was. I was married, eventually had 3 kids, and my gender blows up in the middle of my marriage. At probably one of the peaks of my ministry, my gender stuff blows up in my marriage and in my personal world quietly at first. And so, so that was a really challenging thing. And I do want to say this, gender dysphoria, which is the clinical diagnosis for somebody who experiences their internal gender identity differing from their biological sex or the gender assigned at birth, right? Gender dysphoria is like living every single day like you're at a funeral. If anyone's ever been to a funeral home, you're in uncomfortable clothes and you have to talk to people and people laugh and you feel weird about laughing and having fun. That is the experience that I had with gender dysphoria, and it was 365 days a year.
Wow. And
that was my life. And so even though I was married and I had kids, I felt this immense, just spiraling, funeral-like existence. And I couldn't even engage with my own children in my home. And that's what dysphoria does to someone. And that's what I was experiencing inside of my marriage. And so, my ex and I, we decided that, through many conversations, many tearful conversations, that we needed to go separate ways. And but at the end of the day, my children love me, and they have walked with me through my transition, and I'm still dad to them. So I just celebrated Father's Day, and I'm a girl. And so, but my girls see me fully as dad, and they also see me fully as a woman. And we, I can say that my relationship with my children has never been better since that moment. So and it was really, and it took time to get there, but we did. And so I'm thankful for that.
Yeah. Yeah. How did Christians respond at that time? So when you